Ecclesiastes Chapter 4. You should be grateful that this book is not like Genesis in 50 chapters. And I think God planned it that way for a reason, because he knew if we had to go through 50 chapters of Ecclesiastes, we'd probably be depressed, like and need therapy. And so, but you know, I'm grateful that God preserved this book for us, and that it's there because we have some great insights in it. And so what I find fascinating is that when Solomon began his examination of life under the sun, his views at first were detached and philosophical, right? Let's try to figure it out philosophically, life. And his conclusion was life is meaningless. There's no meaning for life. Well, he didn't like that conclusion, so he began to examine it again, but looking from a different vantage point. And he looked at the vantage point from where people lived. And yet from that vantage point, what he did was he discovered that life really isn't that simple. It was kind of complex. And as he observed real people in real situations, he saw that there was real pain. He saw that as they lived, it was hard sometimes. He saw death, that it was a reality. He looked at time, and he looked at eternity, and he looked at judgment. And it left him wondering how justice would ever come, you know, and leaving him pretty much bummed out, and that gets us to where we are today, where he's going to look at really human responsibility. And I titled our message, Does God Matter in Our Responsibilities? And I really struggled with that one, because oftentimes when you bring responsibilities from the pulpit, people are like, oh no, he's going to get legalistic on us. He's going to tell us what we have to do and don't do. And it's not that at all. Because life is full of responsibilities. There are things that we need to be responsible for. But in particular here, what Solomon's going to look at and tie it to is really justice and how we relate to each other. So the responsibilities that we have to live in this world together, and the responsibility we have one to another. And today we're going to answer that question, does God matter in our responsibilities? And we're going to examine our relationships in several areas, actually just 3. But first we're going to examine our relationship with the oppressed. Then we'll look at our relationship with work. And finally, we will look at our responsibilities to our relationships with each other. And so here we go. Does God matter in our responsibility to the oppressed? Verses 1 through 3. Solomon starts by saying, Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressor, there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore, I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet, better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Talk about a depressing 3 verses. You know what I mean? You read that and you're like, holy cow, I think I need therapy now. Like, But Solomon starts it out with this word then. And what that word does is it connects this with the end of chapter 3, where he concluded that justice and judgment don't seem to come. That people are just kind of roaming around and people are being treated unfairly. And as he moves on, he says, then I returned. So he comes back to this place and he says, considered. This word consider means this. It means to give attention to. So he comes to this conclusion that justice is not really happening, but now he's considering a people group and he's giving attention to this group, and he gives us attention to those who are oppressed. Or he says, I give attention, or I consider all the oppression that is done under the sun. Now the word oppression means this, to press upon, violate, defraud, do violence, get deceitfully, or to be crushed. So he considers these things. He considers these people. I have a question for you. When was the last time you considered oppression? You see, it's easy to turn a blind eye to it. It's easy to kind of get numb. And I actually had to wrestle with this question since we've been back from Uganda. God, why did you bring me to a place to show me such oppression and such poverty, only to show me what I couldn't do? And I've wrestled with that. I've really wrestled with God because of that. But I will tell you that this week God met me where I was, and he gave me the answer to that question. Because the truth of the matter is we will never be able to solve the world's problems when it comes to oppression. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough of anything to do it. But maybe we were never meant to meet all the needs. Maybe God had a different plan in mind. But when was the last time you considered oppression? I thought, well, I'm going to consider it this week. Obviously, I was here. So I was sitting in Starbucks on Tuesday, and I pulled out my computer, and I opened it up. And as I opened it up, I thought, I'm going to Google oppression, because that's how you consider oppression, right? You Google it. And so as I Googled it, I thought, well, I don't necessarily want to read articles on it. I'm just curious, if I hit the image button, what will I see? So I click on the image tab, expecting to see a bunch of pictures of oppression, of oppressed people, of poverty, of all kinds of stuff. But to my surprise, you know what I found? Not pictures of oppressed people, but banners of political agendas. Broke my heart. You see, there's a problem when something that impacts people becomes political. It strips the people of their dignity, their value, and their worth. I did spend some time recently talking to oppressed people, and I'm not talking about the people that were in Uganda. I'm talking people in our own community, whether it's the homeless or the guy that, the homeless guy in particular I'm thinking of is, he was a fellow Raider fan, and he was outside of the Little Caesars in Sonora. And I just happened to walk by and say, hey, how's it going? And he said, I'm just here waiting for somebody to come up with $5, so bring me $5 so I can hopefully get some food. And we began to talk, come to find out he's from Angels Camp. He was a Bret Hart alum, graduated in 1979. He's got he's got an aneurysm, and he says, I'm just living out my days till I die. And as we talked, it was heartbreaking, because one of the things he said, he goes, it's just really hard for me to know that my life has become a pawn in a political agenda. And it just crushed me. And one of the things I found is that it is a lot easier for us to want to solve the problem, because we come to the conclusion that we can't, and therefore we don't feel guilty because we can just do what we can. But are we really doing what we're supposed to be doing? Here what we see is that he considered the oppression. He looked at their tears, and what he found was what? That they didn't have a comforter. You see, it is a lot easier to solve problems than to look at the tears of the comfortless. F.B. Myers said this. He said, "Oh, the tears of the oppressed, the tiny children, the terror-stricken fugitives from the Turk, the European trader, and the drunken tyrant at home. Through all the centuries, tears have flowed, enough to float a navy." The oppression is all around us. And what Solomon saw is he considered the oppression, and he considered the oppressed, and he saw the tears. He saw that they were comfortless. What he realized was that that to the oppressed, the power is always on the oppressor's side. And he looked at them with a broken heart, and he said they had no comforter. That word comforter brings with it the idea of one who is willing to associate with an individual. So what Solomon is saying is that there is no one willing to associate with the oppressed. And Solomon concluded that it was bleak, it was a bummer, it was no good. And he lists three things. The first thing he shows us is that there's oppression and exploitation, that there's pain and sorrow in the lives of innocent people. And the last one is that there was an unconcern on the part of those who could have brought comfort. So it gets hard, it gets tough. He was devastated with his conclusion. So much so that what does he say? Well, it's better to be dead than to be alive and oppressed. But then he takes it a step further and he says, you know what's even better than that is to never have been born at all. Because he would never have to see the evil works of sinful men if he wasn't born. That was Solomon's conclusion. So the million-dollar question now becomes, Solomon was a king. Why didn't he do anything about it? Why didn't the king come up with a solution? We need to understand that even if the king could have done something to solve the problem, it would have created kind of more problems as he interfered with the governmental inner workings, and he would really be revealing that there was way more corruption than he really thought at the beginning, right? So how do we respond to the reality of oppression and the reality that people are living life like this? Because think about just that guy in front of Little Caesars. I'm just here waiting to die. In that statement, what is he saying? It was much better to be dead than alive. So this isn't far from home. But what is our responsibility? As Christians, what is our responsibility to the oppressed? What can we do? What should we do? Number one, we need to pray for those who are in authority, those who have the resources to make a difference. But then we also need to do our part assuring that just laws are passed and are fairly enforced. We need to really be a voice for the voiceless. But more importantly, we need to live in the reality that God's going to bring people into our lives that are comfortless. And we need to recognize that though we can't change the global problem, we can impact one life at a time. And we need to comfort those who need it. Romans 12:15 tells us this: we should rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And what Jesus wants us to see is he wants us to see the oppressed people as people who have dignity, value, and worth, people that he died for. But then Jesus wants you to know that he chose you to be a loving channel to reach the oppressed, comforting them that they might feel his love. How do we do that? Well, we kind of goes to the next question. Does God matter in our responsibility to our work in verses 4 through 8? In verse 4, he begins again. I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. And so Solomon, as he looked at those who were successful because of all their hard work and their toil and all their skillfulness, what he saw is that what it brought was envy. People wish they had what those people had. That jealousy made life seem like vanity and the grasping for wind. And he's going to draw a conclusion, and he's going to really cause us to reflect on the value of contentment. Living within our means, living with what God is giving us, living with the reality that, we can't fix everything. We can't change the whole world, but we can change the whole world of one by being there. He goes and he says, the fool holds his hand and consumes his own flesh. The fool folds his hand and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches, but he who never asks. For whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. And so Solomon compares the hands of two groups, those who don't work and those who do work. And we have a responsibility to work, but why? What's the meaning behind what we do? Well, Solomon wants to show us how hard work and success are good and not to be envied. But he also wants us to know that laziness is wrong and ultimately destructive. That we were created to work. But both of these need to learn what? Contentment. We need to live within our means. We need to be content with what God has given us. You see, the working man thinks that money will bring peace. But what have we found? That he often has no time to enjoy what he worked so hard for. The idle man thinks, well, if I just do nothing, well, that's the answer. That's how I'll get peace. But ultimately, his lifestyle will end up destroying him. The man who understands his responsibility to his work can enjoy both his labor and his results. Meaning you understand that you work for a reason, that God's gifted you to do certain things, and it becomes a joy, and you can enjoy your work, not just endure it to get the benefits of a paycheck at the end of the week. This guy who understands his responsibility, he can balance his work with rest. But then Solomon looks at this guy who lives an independent life. He was an independent man. He worked hard. And as he looked at him, he thought, I got to question that guy and find out why he's doing what he's doing. And as he questions him, what he finds is that this guy had no relatives or anyone to help him, nor did he have a desire to help anybody or find any help for himself. What did he want? He wanted the profit just for himself. I'm going to work hard so I can have it all. And he was busy, but he had no time to enjoy what he was gaining. And if he died, he had no family to inherit his wealth. It was crazy. We went to a wedding yesterday. We loaded up the van with all 10 of us, and we drove to Reading. That's a horrible drive, in case anybody is wondering. And so we're heading back, and we're driving, and it's dark, and I'm driving, and I just start thinking the weirdest things. Now, you got to remember, I've been thinking about this passage all week, and so I'm driving, and I'm thinking about this passage, and I'm asking myself, if we get in a wreck and all of us die, who gets my stuff? That's what I thought. For 2.5 hours, that's what I was thinking. And then I was thinking, well, it was disturbing. It really was. I mean, that's kind of a morbid thing to think. I mean, I got my whole family in a van, but I was like, where's it going to go? So I could understand kind of Solomon's dilemma here. I mean, if we can't pass it on, if we can't enjoy it, if we're not investing it, then what? Kind of crazy. Solomon's conclusion was all of his labor was in vain. And what we realize is this: the more one has, the more one wants. Isn't that true? Because there's always something new to buy, a new toy to play with, or a new place to go, isn't there? Something that's always pulling at us. But we all know that it rarely brings lasting satisfaction. So why is it that it takes most people 60 to 70 years before they come to this realization? I mean, have you ever wondered, why did you do all these things? Have you ever asked, what am I really working for? Solomon really is saying, God really is saying it's better to have less and be content than to have more and constantly grasping for the wind. But what we see here is God has blessed us with different abilities, with different talents, that we might be a blessing. We've really been blessed in this country. We really have. But you haven't just been blessed so that you can get more blessings. You've been blessed to be a blessing. I was reminded of how that works, and this is where I said sometimes I felt like maybe I was preaching to the choir this morning. I walked in on Friday, and I barely get in the double doors before I'm met by Yvonne, who was cleaning the kitchen. She chases me down and goes, I got to tell you something. And I'm thinking, oh no, I'm in trouble. Because we got this saying around here, don't put it down, put it away. And then we made this lanyard of shame that said, I put it down and not away. And if you put something down, we have to wear that for the day. And so I thought she was chasing me down to put the lanyard of shame on me so that I'd have to wear it. But she comes chasing me down, just could hardly contain herself. She goes, I got to show you something. She runs to her purse and she grabs her wallet and she hands me this check, and it's a check for $100. I'm like, great. Like, what's this for? It's for the soap man. Soap man? What are you talking? Oh, the soap man, the guy. Remember, we've been getting money. So we've been able to send him $226. But there was a $100 check for the soap man, so now he was able to get $320, which is over 1 million shillings. And she got that check because she was so excited about the soap man and the soap that she was sharing this with somebody, that this person couldn't contain themselves, couldn't get to her checkbook quick enough. She's telling me this she's all excited. I'm like, whoa, calm down. Like, there's medicine for this. Just relax. Yeah. And she's like, she couldn't get her. I'm like, oh, and maybe I'm comfortable, but you see, we've been blessed to be a blessing. And I got a text message from the guy, and he sent me a picture of this machine. And what this machine does is it takes its palm nuts, it shells them, and he says, this machine shells them and gives me the seed. He then takes that seed into his shop where he puts it in the press where he gets the oil to make the soap. Now, I shared with you guys that he would only be able, he only sold 2 of those a week, making about $5 a week. Well, come to find out, the reason for that was he didn't have the resources to buy more palm seed. So now I'm getting a picture after I see this new machine that he bought of this pile of palm seed. He then says, I can now extend my production. And then he said, thank you for the blessing, and I'm going to go bless somebody else. You see, we've been blessed to be a blessing. It's what God told Abram in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So when we go to work, what we realize is God blessed me with the ability to do these things, not so that I could get more stuff, but so that I could be a blessing. And it's crazy how just the little things in life can really be a blessing to somebody else. So open your eyes. and ask God to reveal to you who you might be a blessing to today. It goes on, and we're going to answer this question: does God matter in our relationship responsibilities? Verses 9 through 16. And he says, 2 are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And so Solomon, as he thought about living life alone, what does he say? That if you live alone, it's worse than having people in your life, because we weren't created to be alone. And he develops this idea by noting that 2 are better than 1, and he gives us 4 reasons why. The first one, he says, if there's 2, that you have a greater productivity, right? 2 guys can accomplish way more than 1 guy can. And then you have a good reward for what you do. He says also that, if somebody falls in a pit, they have somebody to pick them up, so they have help in that time of need. He then goes on and he says, well, if they're cold, they can be warm, right? So there's comfort in life with 2 or more in your life. And then ultimately there's safety and security because 2 can withstand. And Solomon, what he's doing is he's reminding us of the great value in human relationships. The value that we have when we're with one another. And then he gives us a final thought by dealing with the goodness of companionship by looking at this threefold cord. In verse 8, Solomon started with the number 1. In verse 9, he said 2. And here in verse 12, he says 3. 1 cord could be broken easily. 2 cords required a little more strength to break, but it can be broken. But a threefold cord, when it's woven together, is not easily broken. Try it as an experiment. See how true that is, and you'll find that it is true. Now, Solomon had more than numbers in mind here. His whole point was that the unity of these 3 cords woven together is a beautiful picture of relationships, especially a relationship where God is the center. We were created for relationships. We weren't created to be alone, and therefore we have a responsibility to cultivate these relationships. By doing life together, by listening to each other and being there for one another, by laughing with one another and weeping with one another. And he goes on in verse 13, he says, better a poor and wise youth than an old foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of a prison to be king. Although he was born poor in his kingdom, I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end to all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and the grasping for wind. I think it's interesting how Solomon concludes this chapter, because it started with what? The oppression that have nobody. And he concludes by what? This guy who was in prison, who now comes out and becomes king. A guy who was there probably because he was oppressed at one time in his life, or he had issues. And Solomon observes and says it's better to be poor and wise than old and foolish, having health, wealth, and stature. Showing us that this young guy rose out of misfortune and he achieved great wealth, status, and fame. And because of that, people benefited from it. My point is this: those oppressed people that God brings into our life, we never know how God might establish them. We never know who they may be. They may be the next king. But God is not a respecter of persons. He's a guy that loves people. And afterwards, all these people rejoiced with him. This young man, he achieved much. He became famous, but he understood something. He understood that fame is short-lived. He knew that even if it lasted his lifetime, it would not live much beyond that. Now, Solomon's conclusion with that was that it was vanity and the grasping for wind. So the moral of the story is this: wealth and possession are no guarantee of success. And poverty and failures are no barriers for achievements. I love that. The key is wisdom. You see, no matter where Solomon went or what he studied, he knew that if he looked up, he would see God was in charge of life, balancing its varied experiences. If he looked within him, he saw man was made for eternity, and that God would make all things beautiful in their time. When he looked ahead, he saw death. When he looked around, he understood the complexity of life, seeing its difficulties and how it is not easily explained. But no matter where you look, you will see trials, you'll see people, you'll see problems, but you'll see people who need encouragement to keep going and not give up. Solomon wasn't cynical about life at all. Nowhere does he tell us to get out of the race or go into some corner and retreat and just hide there and it'll make things better. Why? Because life doesn't stand still. Life is constantly on the move. It comes at you full speed, no warning. So what do? We stand up. We take it. And with God's help, we make the most of it. We realize I can't do everything, but I can do one thing. And that's what I need to do. If this chapter teaches us anything, it's that we need one another. Why? Because two are better than one. We need each other. Yeah, there's some advantages to independence, but they become disadvantages the older we get when we discover that. Who's going to take care of me? I had the opportunity to take my grandma to see her, see my grandfather's tomb, and then to go out to lunch with three, 88, 90 to 93-year-old ladies. Talk about fun. It was a hoot. But I got to take her there, and, she was just diagnosed with lung cancer. And so we're working through that with her. And, so when we got to my grandfather's grave, the first thing out of her mouth was, "Oh, dear, I'll be with you soon." I'm like, really? I didn't want to hear that. Like, I know you're 93, but you're mean. You're going to live to be like 100. But then we went to, I said, "Okay, we're going to go take your girlfriends out to lunch." She said, "Yeah. But don't worry, there's not too many of them. There's only a couple left." But I thought, man, that's the reality of where she lives, is that she's outlived most of her friends. And she realized that friendships are important, that life is important, that having a balanced life is where it's at. But this chapter emphasizes the balance of life, that it's better is a handful with quietness than both hands full of toiling and grasping for wind, as Solomon put it. You see, it is good to have the things that money can buy, provided that you don't lose the things that money can't. the people in your life. So ask yourself, what is it really costing you in terms of life to get the things that are important to you? What's it costing you? Then ask yourself this. How much of the permanent are you sacrificing to get your hands on the temporary? Jesus put it this way in Mark 8:36 through 37. He says, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" So guys, may we live for eternity as we embrace the relationships that God has given us, that we see that they're a gift from God. As we look at the people that God has brought there and love them, may we work realizing that we've been blessed so that we could be a blessing by taking the things that God has given us and investing in, much like the boy who brought his lunch to Jesus. Think about that. How did that boy get his lunch? I'm sure his mom got up early that morning, like she did every day, and packed in a little brown bag, probably not, in a basket, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here, son, here's your lunch for the day. And then that little boy had an encounter with Jesus. And he took what he had. I mean, think about it. 5 loaves, 2 fish, feed 5,000 people? Hardly. But there's something that happens when we take the things that God has blessed us with, put them in his hands, then allow him to give it back to us so that we can then distribute it. Much like the soap man. You guys bought a bar of soap, which enabled him to buy more stuff so that he could make more soap, so that he could then do what? Be a blessing to somebody else. See, when we give what we have, put it in God's hand, he multiplies it exponentially. But realize that we've been blessed that we might be a blessing, that we then might go and comfort those who are oppressed. Realizing that we're the loving channels that God uses to love the world around you. And then what we do is we see that people have dignity, value, and worth, and that our every breath has meaning. And then we rejoice because God is doing something that we can't. Like I said, I wrestled with God. Why would you send me to a place only to show me what I couldn't do? And what I heard God tell me this week was, Shawn, I brought you to that place because you needed to see what you couldn't do so that you could see what I could do. And that's the same thing that I think he wants you to know today. So may we be those that take that relationship responsibility seriously, that we love the people around us, that we would work hard, and that we would comfort those that are oppressed. To God's glory and our joy. And then let's watch. Because maybe God will bring out of that oppression the next king that's going to make a difference.